Hello everyone, I am here with chapter 10 of the Hardy Boys Viking Symbol Mystery. An Amazing Suspect. I'm Frank Hardy, and this is my brother Joe, Frank told the Mountie. Why do you want us? And how did you locate us? Chet asked. The pilot pulled out his wallet and showed his identification card. I'm Corporal Fergus of the Fort Smith station, he said. I have an urgent message for you. So I flew downriver from 2,000 feet up. I spotted you walking along the beach. Has anything happened to our family? Joe asked the officer quickly. No, the message concerns the man impersonating your father, Corporal Fergus replied. The Edmonton police have been notified that someone else called to see Mr. Baker Jones at the hospital. It's thought he may be an accomplice of the imposter because Mr. Baker Jones doesn't know anyone around here. Frank asked, do the police know his identity? They have investigated the Edmonton hotels, said the officer, and learned that a man of his description is registered in one of the J.C. Phillips. Right now, they have a stakeout at the hotel and plan to follow the man as soon as he's spotted. 2 of us should be there, Frank said seriously. Joe, you and Chet go back to Edmonton. Caribou and I will continue our search for the thieves up here. Fine, his brother agreed. We'll meet you back at Fort Smith in a couple of days. Maybe your dad's imposter will lead us to the stolen ruined stone, Chet said. That's possible, Joe agreed. Could be the stone wasn't brought up here after all. Anyhow, we'll have both places covered. Chet looked worried. Say, do we get back to Edmonton? Corporal Fergus stepped forward. I'm to fly you to Fort Smith, he said. From there, you can get a plane to Edmonton. Swell, thanks a million, Joe said. Caribou spoke up. Meantime, Frank and I will return to Fort Smith. We will look for thieves on the way and travel most of the night. Frank had a new idea. When we get there, let's rent a float plane and start a search from the air, Caribou. We might sight the stolen aircraft. The Mountie shook his head skeptically. In this area, that will be like looking for a needle in a haystack. We are working on the case, too, with not much luck. If I know my brother, Joe said, grinning, he'll find the plane if it's around. Joe and Chet said goodbye to Frank and Caribou and climbed into the RCMP float plane. The 2 on shore watched and waved as the sleek craft turned and taxied off over the small lake. The water sprayed in tall sheets as the pontoons lifted and the plane took off, just clearing the tops of the spruce trees rimming the water. Frank and Caribou retraced their steps to the canoe. They carried the craft and other equipment back to Slave River and were soon headed for Fort Smith. Meanwhile, in the RCMP plane, Corporal Fergus pointed out the densely forested land and the snake-like outline of Slave River below. When they approached the Fort Smith airfield, the afternoon flight to Edmonton was in progress of landing. Corporal Fergus called over the roar of the motor. We have to land in the river, but I'll ask the tower by radio to hold the plane for you. The control tower agreed, and after setting down, the boys took time to thank Corporal Fergus before they climbed out of the plane, which had taxied to the airfield dock. Lots of luck, the corporal called out to them. Maybe we'll see you later, said Joe as he and Chet waved goodbye. Soon the 2 boys had boarded the waiting plane, which took off seconds later. The trip was fast and smooth, and the boys landed at Edmonton, rested and ready for more work. The taxi ride from the airport to the city was long and slow through heavy traffic. Joe shifted impatiently in his seat. I hope we get there before they question the man, he said. I'd like to be on hand for the surprise. When they finally pulled up in front of the Edmonton Police Headquarters, Inspector Knight was just coming out of the front door. "Hello, boys. Glad you're here," he said, smiling warmly and extending his hand. "We are going over to the hospital. Our stakeout reports that the suspect is heading there." Joe was surprised. "You haven't picked him up yet?" he asked. "The fellow really hasn't done anything," the inspector replied. "But if he goes to the hospital to see Baker Jones again, we'll question him." Joe and Chet drove off in a police car with Inspector Knight and another officer who was at the wheel. When they reached the hospital, the driver parked at the side entrance. "We will sit here and keep watch," said the inspector. 10 minutes later, he exclaimed, "There he is!" Inspector Knight indicated a man coming down the street toward the front of the hospital. He had a bushy back pompadour and mustache, and the boys noticed was walking in with a dense... Turn that phone off. He had a bushy black pompadour and a mustache, and the boys noticed was walking with a distinct limp. He went slowly up the steps to the building and into the entrance lobby. Both officers and the two boys slipped from the car and followed quietly. Inside, they saw the stranger go directly to the reception desk and heard him ask to see Mr. Baker Jones. "Your name, please?" the clerk asked politely. "Phillips." Instantly, the inspector went forward. "We'd like to ask you a few questions, Mr. Phillips," he said. The stranger swung around quickly. Suddenly, Joe gasped. Then he dashed up to the man and stood stock still, staring at him. The bushy-haired caller straightened up and smiled. "Joe! Chet!" he said in a familiar voice. Chet's mouth flew open. "What? Mr. Hardy?" He gaped. "Boy, oh boy, you had me fooled." "But not Joe," the detective said. "What does this mean?" Inspector Knight asked, greatly perplexed. Moving away from the reception desk, Mr. Hardy stripped off his mustache and wig. He introduced himself quickly to the Canadian police officer, then explained, I thought I would be able to fool the ruined stone crooks by coming up here in disguise. Make them think I was still in Bayport," he chuckled. "I didn't figure on getting caught by my own son." "I'm sorry, Dad," Joe said. "Guess maybe I spoiled your plan." "I doubt it," Mr. Hardy said, putting an arm around his son's shoulders. "You boys were really on the alert. I'm proud of you." He turned to Inspector Knight. "As long as we are both here, perhaps we can compare notes on the case." "Fine, Mr. Hardy," said the inspector. "I've wanted to meet you for a long time, only I'm afraid my department has turned up any new leads to the imposter." "It hasn't turned up any new leads, or up to the stolen stone or the money." "How is Mr. Baker Jones?" Joe asked. "The hospital told me this morning," Inspector Knight replied, "that he is improving, but still in no condition to answer questions." "Well, we'll keep working on the case," Mr. Hardy promised. The Bayport group said goodbye to the officers, then went back to the detective's hotel room for a conference. Joe told his father about the knife thrower and gave him details of the Fort Smith and Slave River trip. He explained where Frank and Caribou were and about their continuing hunt for the stolen float plane. Mr. Hardy was especially interested to hear that they had found one of the gas drums and a wrench from Yellowknife Lodge. Joe asked, "Dad, have you had any more news from Sam Radley?" "Yes," replied the detective. "Just before I left home, I had a report Sam thinks the Lodge thefts gang is still operating around Slave Lake. He, Biff, and Tony have traced them as far as the town of Snowdrift." That's the last I've heard. Joe looked thoughtful. Dad, he said, I have a hunch there might be another motive behind these lodge thefts besides burglary. The gang might be using the stolen float plane for some other purpose. You have a point there, Joe, his father agreed. Finding the plane would be a big step in cracking the case. Well, we'll get back to Fort Smith as early as possible tomorrow, Joe proposed, and help Frank and Caribou search the air. Good, said the detective. I'll remain here in case I can speak with Mr. Baker Jones. Chet offered to make reservations for a morning flight. This done, the three showered, then had a juicy steak dinner. Afterward, Joe sent a telegram to the Hudson Bay Company store at Fort Smith, telling Frank that he and Chet would be there before noon the next day. After a quick breakfast the following morning, Joe and Chet took the plane back to Fort Smith. When they landed, Frank and Caribou were waiting at the airport to greet them. What's new? Frank asked. Our dad has changed his name, said Joe, grinning, and told the story. Frank laughed heartedly. I've arranged to rent a float plane, he said. It's moored at a dock on the river. Today, Caribou boomed, our luck will be better. We searched by air for the stolen plane. Shortly afterward, with Frank at the controls, the foursome took off. Soon they were clear of the airfield and circling over and away from the town of Fort Smith. We'll fly a box search south of Great Slave Lake and west of Snowdrift, Frank announced. Keep your eyes open for any sign of the stolen plane. The four were silent as they peered intently out the windows. They flew for an hour in the plane pattern. Not one of the searchers spotted the slightest clue of the missing craft. Bon Terre, Caribou burst out finally. These woods are too thick to see into. The plane droned over one small lake after another. On Chet's head was nodding sleepily when Joe called out, I see something. He pointed to the L-shaped body of water. There's the plane. Scarbaloo, Caribou thundered. We find it. The young pilot banked the light plane around and they went down low, retracing their course. Over the lake, the craft Joe had sighted was resting in the middle of the water. The trees at the edge of the lake were tall and the undergrowth thick. It's going to be tricky to land down there, Frank said, circling again. But here goes. He cut the engine enough to side-slip the plane over the high trees and onto the surface of the lake. As they straightened out for the downwind leg of the approach, Joe suddenly shouted to Frank, It's just an old wreck. One of the wings is in the water. We are already committed to this landing, Frank told him. We'll have to go ahead. The plane continued to drop into the landing position. Frank lowered the rudder and started pulling the throttle back. Suddenly, Caribou shouted, Watch out! Logs! Directly beyond and just under the surface of the water, they could see a twisted tangle of rough logs. The float plane was heading right for them. Frank jammed the throttle ahead, then eased back on the stick gradually. Too much lift will throw us into a stall, he told himself. From behind came Chet's frantic cry, The trees! Watch the trees! Frank's brow glistened with perspiration as he manipulated the stick gently. The dark woods loomed up ahead of them as their old plane climbed slowly. The boys gritted their teeth, and Caribou clenched his seatbelt until his knuckles grew white. Would they gain altitude in time to avoid a crash? You'll have to wait till the next chapter to find out.